to take a few moments and talk about a topic I call the legacy of handmade objects. In order to get my arms around a topic this huge, I want to tell a few stories, which is something I love. And I want to highlight the lives of two remarkable women, my grandmother Maisie and my daughter Mary. Maisie Kelsey Fitzgerald Sligh was my paternal grandmother, Granny Sligh as we called her. Granny Sligh was born in the mountains of Virginia in 1907 to an abjectly poor family. The family's story is that her parents died in an institution called the poorhouse, something like a debtor's prison. Granny Sligh married young to escape her childhood, only to find herself plunged into an alcoholic marriage with my grandfather, who drank up all the money before it ever made it home. My father tells stories of his dad drinking vanilla extract out of the cupboard and siphoning alcohol off the top of Sterno cans in order to feed his addiction. Granny Sligh had 8 children. By the time I came along, my grandfather had committed suicide. One of her children had died as an infant. The other children were scattered around the world, and there were dozens of us grandchildren. And I can say that as a child, I often saw Granny as kind of a bitter, angry old woman. Perhaps, as I think back now, there might be some reason for her to have felt that way at times. But one year for Christmas, Granny decided to marshal her limited resources and create a gift for each of the families of her children. I don't remember her ever doing that any other time, but this particular year, drawing on some knowledge of the past that I can't trace, she decided to create embroidered trapunto framed pieces for each of her 7 surviving children and their families. Just briefly, trapunto is an embroidery method where you stitch around the outer edge of figures on fabric in order to give it a 3D effect. I know that Granny's resources were limited. I know that gathering frame, fabric, glass, film material, and threads would have been a major expense. And I also know that creating those pieces would have taken the better part of a year. I still have the trapunto piece that Granny Sligh made for our family. But I have to say, it represents a bittersweet memory. When we got it, I think all of the families kind of looked at it and thought, that's not too pretty. And it's kind of old-fashioned, and some of us grandchildren were always a little scared of Granny. I know my parents hung it in the basement, where it would seldom be seen. But as I've thought back through the years and I've considered the life my grandmother lived and understood some of the struggles that she endured, that picture represents a great deal of perseverance and hope in the midst of adversity. I've never been able to get rid of it. It doesn't fit in any of the decor of my home. But at the same time, it's an enduring piece of who I am and the legacy that I bring forward. I suspect every one of us has pieces like this in our family histories, perhaps in our homes. In reclaiming those items and the stories they tell, we are connecting with who we are as part of the human family. And those legacies are meant to be carried forward. Speaking of legacies, my 3 children are the beat of my heart. I look for every opportunity to spend time with them and to pass along their heritage to them. About 10 years ago, my daughter Mary and I took a trip to Greece. Mary's an accomplished photographer, and one day as we were rambling around Athens, we stepped into a fabric shop, and Mary took a photograph of the proprietor, an older man, standing in front of hundreds of bolts of colorful fabric. When Mary graduated from nursing school, I turned that photograph into a cross-stitch creation. I've done something like this for each of my children when they graduated from college. Now, I can honestly say to Mary, and Mary can say to those who come after her, that for about 18 months, working approximately 24 hours every week, stitching well over 60,000 stitches, I thought about Mary and I thought about the trip we took and the images of that time together. No fabric, no threads could ever be as valuable as those memories. Think about this. That's 725,760 seconds of concentrated energy for one singular purpose. Something that I've discovered pretty amazing as I've thought about these two pieces, the trapunto horses and the counted cross-stitch fabric. My granny, Sligh, wanted to be a nurse. I know that because the family story tells us that she worked in a tuberculosis hospital as a young woman, and later she sat with aged patients as a nurse's aide. Granny never had the opportunity to pursue her education, but I think the dream was always there for her. My daughter Mary knew she wanted to be a nurse when she was in preschool. I would take her and her brothers to the library, and she checked out the same book every time, The Story of an Emergency Room Nurse. We actually bought a copy of that book and gave it to her when she headed off to nursing school as an inspiration. Mary had the chance to pursue her dream, and she's pretty passionate about it. You can talk about many things with my daughter, but when you get on the subject of health care for the poor and homeless, you better wait out. You better watch out. She's going to tell you what needs to happen. And so I think in a kind of a marvelous way, life has a way of circling back around. Perhaps Mary is fulfilling a dream that Maisie never had the chance to pursue. Handmade objects are often forgotten and bypassed in our modern culture. Many times people spend hours, months working on creations. And yet with the rush of modern culture, the devaluation of work by women and manual laborers, many times those pieces become cast-off items. If someone takes the time to put their essence into a handmade object, it's worth cherishing. My own connection to handmade objects comes as a result of my 50-year passion for fiber arts. And there's a book, if you're at all interested, I hope you'll look up. It's called Threads of Life: The History of the World Through the Eye of a Needle by a Scottish artist named Claire Hunter. When Claire Hunter writes about the value of fabric and textiles, she says this: the textiles we keep demand to be lifted, stroked, handled. They literally connect us to our past. Cloth softens with handling. It absorbs the human touch and the smells that surrounded it when it was being made. Sweat, spices, perfume, wood smoke. Bury your nose in a textile and you can literally bring up the sights and sounds of people long ago and far away. And if it is a family heirloom, you can be transported to a forgotten blend of family fragrance. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? A forgotten blend of family fragrance. I think everybody has a spark of creativity. Don't tell me you don't. One of the things that we find is that creativity is manifest in different people in so many different ways: metalwork, woodwork, painting, sculpture, fiber arts, cooking. It's important to think about what aspect of handmade work appeals to you. and to think about the value of taking the time of digging in and understanding and learn the medium being used, and thinking about how we can ourselves create a legacy. Creating handmade objects can ignite the flames of creativity in each of us. And I'm also convinced that creating handmade objects and working with our hands cultivates a rich internal spirit. I have one stitching friend who always says that stitching centers her, gives her a kind of tranquility. Now, I will admit, you have to find the kind of handmade work that gives you that tranquility and doesn't create tension and conflict. And that will be different for each person. But creating and working with our hands is a way of finding a meditative process. We know that after World War I in New Zealand, wounded veterans were taught embroidery in order to calm their PTSD symptoms. In World War II, women were held prisoners of war in China, and we found the remnants of their embroidery that helped them to express their fears and create a memory of their suffering. Creating handmade objects is a way that we can connect ourselves to the human experience and in a lot of ways be transported from the day to day as we become a part of that great cosmic sweep of life that surrounds us in the world. When all is said and done, whether the work be expert or amateur, pretty or ugly, hard or soft or impermanent, handmade objects are really the story of who we are as part of this human experience that we're a part of. It helps connect us to the story that has come before us and that will pass along after us. Creating handmade objects is a way to complete the journey that we walk together. So there's a couple things I want you to think about doing when you leave here today. Number one, go and see if you can identify some of those legacy items that are part of your household or that you may have grown up with. I suspect that a lot of them are hidden away, maybe folded up and put in a dresser somewhere or hung in the basement like Granny Sligh's piece was. Take them out, lift them up, put them in a position of prominence, and learn the stories that go with them, because that's what's really important. And tell those stories to anybody who will listen. Children, nieces, nephews, somebody walking down the sidewalk. And then the second part of the quest, I truly believe is equally as important. Find the handmade work that ties you into the universe, that gives you a sense that you are creating something that never existed before and that nobody else can do in quite the same way, that you can pass along as part of the legacy of the future. I want to end with another story. This is about my other grandmother, Mabel, who was my soulmate. The story of this really bright white and green scarf. This was the first piece of fiber arc I created at the age of 12, 50 years ago. Now, my grandmother Mabel was about 4 foot 10 inches tall, and she only ever wore soft pastel colors. But I have a memory of her with this scarf around her face, wearing it as if it were made of gold and a gift from the King of England. Why? Because her grandson made it. Create your story through the legacy of handmade objects.